She stood on the stage at the age of 9, under lights so bright they turned the whole world white, and 40 million people fell in love with her. They watched her grow up in their living rooms, week after week, season after season. She was theirs, and they were certain they knew everything about her. But there are things the cameras never caught. There are rooms in a life that no spotlight ever reaches, no matter how famous you become. What does it cost a child to belong to an entire nation before she belongs to herself? What happens inside a person when the version of her the world adores is frozen in amber, forever young, forever smiling, while the real woman underneath keeps aging, keeps aching, keeps searching? And here's the question that matters most. When MelissaGilbert finally let herself be seen, fully and honestly, at 61 years old, why did it bring so many people to tears? Not tears of sorrow. Something more complicated than that. Something that takes the whole story to understand. Her name was Melissa Ellen Gilbert, and she was born on May 8, 1964, in Los Angeles, California. But the city she was born into was not the glamorous Hollywood of legend. It was a working city, a hungry city, a place where dreams were raw material, and most people never saw them refined into anything real. Her biological parents gave her up for adoption almost immediately, and that single fact, that early, wordless surrender, would become the first note of a melody she spent decades trying to finish. She was adopted by Paul Gilbert, a comedian and actor, and Barbara Crane, a dancer and actress. On the surface, it sounded like a fairy tale. A little girl chosen by performers, raised in the orbit of show business, given a name and a home in a world that sparkles. But fairy tales are complicated when you live inside them. Paul Gilbert died when Melissa was just 11 years old, a loss that arrived without warning and without mercy, the kind of loss that reorganizes the entire architecture of a child's interior world. Before that, though, before the grief, there was the work. There was always the work. She began performing almost before she could fully read the scripts they handed her. Commercials first, the typical starting point for children who were discovered young and pushed forward quickly by parents who understood that the window of opportunity in Hollywood is narrow and closes fast. But Melissa was not a typical child performer in any way that mattered. There was something in her face that was not merely prettiness. It was presence, a quality that even very young children can carry, rare and instinctive, the ability to make a camera feel like a mirror rather than a machine. By the time she was 9 years old, she had been cast as Laura Ingalls in Little House on the Prairie, based on the beloved book series by Laura Ingalls Wilder. The show premiered in September of 1974 on NBC, and the world that met MelissaGilbert that autumn evening was not prepared for how completely she would own that role, inhabit it, make it breathe. Laura Ingalls was not a perfect girl. She was willful and impulsive, big-hearted and sometimes reckless, a girl who ran across open fields with her bonnet flying loose behind her. And Melissa gave her all of that. She gave her something genuine. The show ran for 9 seasons, from 1974 to 1983. 9 years is a long time under any circumstances. 9 years under the scrutiny of network television, with the pressure of carrying a beloved show, with 40 million weekly viewers expecting you to show up and be luminous. 9 years under those conditions does something to a person, especially when that person is a child becoming an adolescent, becoming a young woman, while the cameras keep rolling and the audience keeps watching and the character they love stays exactly the same. Laura Ingalls was always 9 on the inside, even when MelissaGilbert was 17, 20, 22. The disconnect between who she was becoming privately and who she was required to be publicly had teeth, and it bit her in places she couldn't show. There is a photograph taken on the set of Little House sometime in the late 1970s, just a candid shot from between takes, and in it Melissa is not performing. Her face is turned slightly to the side, her eyes looking at something outside the frame, and she looks tired in a way that no child should look tired. Not sleepy, Tired in the way that adults get tired when they have been carrying something heavy for a long time. Most people who have seen this photo probably never noticed. They were looking at little Laura Ingalls. They did not see the girl underneath. The defining wound of Melissa Gilbert's life arrived not in a single dramatic moment, but in a slow accumulation of losses and displacements that began early and compounded quietly over years. The death of her adoptive father, when she was 11, ripped a hole in her sense of safety that would never fully close. But the wound ran deeper than grief. It ran into identity. Who was she when the cameras were off? Who was she when she was not performing for someone else's comfort, someone else's rating system, someone else's need to see Laura Ingalls smile and run and be fine? She began to look for that self in relationships, the way many young women do, particularly young women who were never quite allowed to be ordinary. Her romantic life in her late teens and early 20s was intense, dramatic, often painful. She was engaged to Rob Lowe, the actor, in the early 1980s. Their relationship was high voltage and very public, and when it ended hard. Then came a marriage to Bo Brinkman in 1988, which produced her son Dakota, and ended in divorce in 1992. Each ending left marks. Each time, Melissa had to figure out not only how to survive the loss, but how to survive it in public, with the eyes of people who had decided she belonged to them still watching, still commenting, still measuring her against the girl on the prairie who was always brave and always cheerful and always found a way. And underneath all of it, unspoken and invisible, was a relationship with alcohol and prescription medication that had taken root years earlier and was growing stronger in the dark. This is the part of the story that does not appear in the fan magazines. This is the part that Melissa herself would not speak aloud for a very long time, because some truths are not ready to be told until you have survived them long enough to find the words. The lowest point came in the 1990s, and it was low in a way that only people who have been there can truly recognize. It was not a single night of obvious catastrophe. It was a long gray season of functioning poorly, of maintaining the appearance of having it together while privately drowning in something she could not name or control. The alcohol, the pills, they had become load-bearing walls in the structure of her daily life, and she did not know yet how to live without them. She was trying to raise her children, trying to sustain a career that had grown uncertain, trying to be the version of herself that everyone needed to see. And she was doing all of this while the ground beneath her kept shifting. There were days, she has said in interviews she gave years later, when getting out of bed felt like climbing a cliff face with no rope. Not dramatic, not visible from the outside, just the relentless gray weight of a life that had gotten away from her somewhere along the way, and the terrible loneliness of being surrounded by people who thought they knew you and realizing that none of them did, because you did not know yourself. This is the kind of pain that does not photograph well. It does not make good television. It does not fit the story that 40 million people had decided was Melissa Gilbert's story. So she carried it quietly, carried it for years, and the carrying wore her down in ways that would eventually become impossible to hide. And then there came a moment, quiet and private, when she had to choose. Not dramatically, not with a thunderclap of revelation. Just a moment, ordinary in its atmosphere, but seismic in its consequence. When she looked at what her life had become and understood that she was going to have to make a different decision, or there would not be much life left to make decisions about. She chose differently. The road back from that kind of darkness is not a road that anyone walks quickly. It is not a montage. It does not compress into a few uplifting scenes with swelling music. It is slow, and it is specific, and it is made of 1,000 small, unglamorous choices, made on mornings when the glamour of recovery seems like a lie someone told you to keep you moving. Melissa entered recovery, and she began the long, painstaking work of rebuilding herself from the inside out. The first breakthrough was not a film. It was not an award. It was quieter than that. It was the beginning of honesty, the beginning of allowing herself to be seen, not as Laura Ingalls, not as the child star, not as the woman who was doing fine, thank you, but as a real person with real damage and real capacity for something better. That honesty was the first light in a long tunnel. It was more valuable than any applause she had ever received. She found her way to Timothy Busfield, the actor, whom she married in 2013 after years of friendship and a courtship that began when both of them were middle-aged and had earned the right to be discerning about love. Timothy was not a rescue. She was not a project. They were two people who had each done enough of their own work to meet each other honestly, and that honesty became the foundation of something genuinely sustaining. She also found her way to a new home, literally. After years of California and the relentless pressure of the industry that had shaped her, Melissa and Timothy moved to a farm in Michigan. A real farm, with land and quiet and the kind of distance from Hollywood that lets a person hear their own thoughts. This was not a retreat. It was a return to something she had carried inside herself since she was 9 years old, running across that television prairie with her hair flying loose. A love of open spaces, of honest labor, of life lived close to the ground. The farm became something she talked about with the kind of specific, particular joy that only genuine things produce. She grew vegetables. She kept chickens. She learned what it meant to participate in a season, to plant something and wait and tend it and harvest it, not on a shooting schedule, not for an audience, but because the earth requires it and rewards you for it. This was the symbolic object of her reinvention. The farm, the land, the open-aired simplicity of a life with soil under its fingernails, and it would recur in everything she said and wrote and stood for from that point forward. The professional reinvention came alongside the personal one, because in a life lived at the intersection of art and identity, those two things cannot be fully separated. She wrote her memoir, Prairie Tale, published in 2009, as she wrote it with a candor that startled people who had expected something lighter, something more careful. The book did not protect anyone. It did not soften the hard parts. It named the addiction. It named the broken relationships. It named the grief and the confusion and the years of not knowing who she was beneath the costume. It was not a comfortable book. It was an honest one, and honesty of that particular variety has a power that comfort can never match. Readers who had loved her as Laura Ingalls found themselves loving her more, not less, for the admission. Because what she was telling them, beneath all the specific details of her specific life, was something universal. She was telling them that the gap between who the world thinks you are and who you actually are can become a place where you lose yourself, and that coming back from that lost place is possible but requires you to stop pretending, to stop performing, to let the real thing be seen, even when the real thing is imperfect, even when the real thing is not what the audience ordered. She also returned to television and theater in ways that felt chosen rather than desperate. She competed on Dancing with the Stars in 2012, and while she did not win, the experience showed audiences a MelissaGilbert who was 50 years old and unafraid of looking imperfect on national television. She was learning. She was laughing. She was present in her body in a way she had not always been, and people responded to that presence with a warmth that had nothing to do with nostalgia. She ran for Congress in Michigan in 2016 as a Democrat before ultimately withdrawing from the race due to health concerns. But the attempt itself said something important about who she had become. She was not content to be remembered. She wanted to be active. She wanted to contribute to something larger than her own story. The health concerns that caused her to step back from the congressional race were significant. She had been dealing with degenerative disc disease in her spine, a condition that caused her real and lasting physical pain and required surgery. She spoke about this, too, without performing strength she did not have. She described the pain honestly, and she described the process of recovery honestly, because by this point in her life, she had learned that honesty was not weakness. Honesty was the only way through. Her personal life, in the years since her marriage to Timothy Busfield, has been characterized by a kind of rootedness she had spent decades searching for. Her children, Dakota, from her marriage to Bo Brinkman, and Michael, from her marriage to Bruce Boxleitner, and their children, are part of a life that has grown richer with time rather than diminishing. She speaks about her family with the particular warmth of someone who understands, from experience, how fragile and precious family is, and how it must be tended the way a garden must be tended, with consistent, unglamorous care. The farm in Michigan is not incidental to this warmth. It is its habitat. The land gave her something that no performance ever quite could. A relationship with time that is honest and biological rather than constructed. Seasons change on their own schedule. Things grow at their own pace. The farm does not care about your resume or your reputation. It only cares whether you show up and do the work. And showing up to do the unglamorous work, in the quiet and the cold and the mud, turned out to be exactly what MelissaGilbert needed to become the person she was always meant to be. She has spoken about faith, not in a loud, declarative way, but in the quiet, particular way of someone who has had to find something to hold on to in the dark and discovered that there was in fact something there. Her spirituality is not performed for the camera. It is not a brand. It is simply a private conviction that the universe is not random, that suffering has meaning, that people are capable of transformation if they are willing to do the work. This conviction is woven into the way she speaks about her life, the way she describes her recovery, the way she talks about the farm and the seasons and the patience that good things require. At 61, MelissaGilbert looks like a woman who has arrived somewhere. Not at a destination. Life is not that tidy, but at a relationship with herself that she did not have at 30 or 40 or even 50. She looks like a woman who has stopped trying to be Laura Ingalls and started being comfortable with the more complicated, more interesting person that Laura Ingalls grew into. She has lines on her face that she has chosen not to erase. She has made public comments about the pressure Hollywood places on women to look perpetually young, and she has declined to participate in that pressure with a directness that some people found startling and others found liberating. This is the transformation that has people in tears. Not tragedy, not collapse, something harder to name and more profound than either of those things. It is the sight of a woman who was given to the public as a child and survived it, who fell into darkness and climbed back out, who built a real life on real ground in Michigan soil with chickens and a garden and a man who loves her and children who call her mother, and who at 61 looks into cameras and tells the truth about all of it without apology. That is not heartbreaking in the way we usually mean that word. It is heartbreaking in a way that beauty is sometimes heartbreaking because it is so real and reality is always more moving than any performance. Her legacy is not Little House on the Prairie. The Little House will follow her name forever in any encyclopedia and any memorial and any list of the things that mattered in American television. Her legacy is something more personal and more durable than that. Her legacy is the proof she offers, by simply existing and speaking honestly, that you could be consumed by a role and survive it. That you can lose yourself and find yourself again. That the person you become in your 50s and 60s, after the addiction and the divorces and the surgeries and the grief and the long work of recovery, can be more authentically you than the person you were at 9, standing in the prairie light before the world got its hands on you. She runs a different kind of farm now than the one Charles Ingalls ran on that television show. The land is real. The seasons are real. The mud and the cold and the labor and the reward are all real. And the woman who tends it, gray-haired and strong and unhurried and honest, is more real than anything she ever performed. Now, here's what I want you to sit with for a moment, because this story is not just hers. You have known what it is to wear a face that isn't quite your own. Maybe not in front of 40 million people, maybe not on a television screen, but you have done it. You have smiled when you were breaking. You have performed capability when you felt hollow. You have looked into the mirror and recognized something weary and uncertain looking back, something that the people around you would not recognize because they had decided who you were a long time ago, and you did not know how to correct them.